fog rolled off the Ohio River like something alive that October night. Thick enough to cut with a knife, I hit the brakes when my headlights caught something impossible, a shadow the size of a man with wings stretched, wide as my pickup truck, gliding maybe 10 feet above the 2-lane blacktop. The radio crackled with static, then went dead silent. When I pulled over at the shoulder to catch my breath, that's when I saw them. Footprints in the soft mud, each one easily twice the size of my boot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. I'd been working emergency dispatch for Mason County for about 8 months by then, long enough to know every back road between Point Pleasant and the river, long enough to hear the old-timers, stories about the Mothman sightings back in '66 and '67, right up until the Silver Bridge came down. But I'm from Michigan originally, moved down here after my divorce, and I figured those tales were just small-town folklore, the kind of thing that keeps tourists coming to the annual festival. That night changed everything. My name's Dave Kellner, and I maintain the county's emergency radio infrastructure. Mostly that means driving around in a beat-up Ford F-150, checking repeater towers, and making sure the state police, fire departments, and EMS can talk to each other when things go bad. It's honest work, and after 20 years fixing telecommunications equipment for the Army, I thought I'd seen everything that could go wrong with radio signals. The weird stuff started about 2 weeks before my encounter on Route 62. I was up at the repeater site on the ridge overlooking the TNT area, that stretch of land north of town where they used to manufacture explosives during World War II. Nothing up there now but concrete, bunkers covered in vines, and a wildlife management area that most folks avoid after dark. The equipment readings were all normal, but I kept picking up interference on the AM bands. Not the usual electrical noise you get from power lines or LED streetlights, but something else. Breathing sounds almost, and whispers that came and went like someone was moving around a microphone in the dark. I mentioned it to Jerry Matthias, the old-timer who runs the diner on Main Street. Jerry's lived in Point Pleasant his whole life, remembers when the Silver Bridge was still standing and the chemical plant was hiring. He just stirred his coffee and gave me one of those looks. "You've been spending much time out at the TNT area?" he asked. "Just checking the tower sites. Why?" "Might want to stick to daytime visits for a while," Jerry said. "Radio waves can pick up all sorts of things out there, especially this time of year." That evening I stopped by the Mason County Library, thinking I'd do some research on local radio interference patterns. Sarah Wendling, the librarian, was just locking up, but she let me in when I explained what I was looking for. "You want the Mothman collection?" she said, leading me to a back room lined with filing cabinets. Mary hires newspaper clippings mostly. She covered all the sightings for the Athens Messenger back in the day. The files were full of yellowed newspaper articles and handwritten testimonies from witnesses: Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Millette, the two couples who first spotted the creature near the old armory building. Their descriptions were remarkably consistent. A man-sized figure with wings, red glowing eyes, capable of keeping pace with a car going 100 miles per hour. But it was the timeline that caught my attention. The sighting started on November 15th, 1966, and continued for over a year. Then they stopped abruptly on December 15th, 1967, the same day the Silver Bridge collapsed, killing 46 people. "What happened after that?" I asked Sarah. "Nothing," she said. "No more sightings for decades, until recently." She pulled out a manila folder marked 2017 present and opened it on the reading table. Inside were photocopied incident reports from the Mason County Sheriff's Department, printouts of internet forum posts, and even a few blurry cell phone photos. "People started seeing things again about 6 years ago," Sarah explained. "Not the Mothman exactly, Something else, smaller but more aggressive. The reports described a pale, hairless creature that moved on all fours, about the size of a large dog but with human-like proportions. Several witnesses mentioned finding scratch marks on their windows and doors, and a few reported episodes of sleep paralysis, waking up unable to move while sensing a presence in their bedroom. One report stood out. A woman named Carol Reeves, who lived in a mobile home near the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, called 911 on 3 separate occasions between August and September. Each time, she reported someone trying to break into her trailer in the middle of the night. When deputies arrived, they found deep scratches in the aluminum siding around her bedroom window, but no sign of an intruder. The third time they responded, Carol was found outside her trailer at 3:30 a.m., barefoot and disoriented, claiming something had been breathing on her neck while she slept. The responding officer noted in his report that the trailer's front door was still locked from the inside. Carol Reeves moved out of the county 2 weeks later. I took photos of the key documents with my phone and drove home thinking about radio interference and scratched windows. My little rental house sits on a quiet side street about a mile from downtown, with a good view of the Ohio River through the bare October trees. Nothing fancy, but it has a screened-in back porch where I like to sit in the evenings with a beer and listen to the freight trains crossing the bridge upstream. That night I set up my portable scanner on the porch table and tuned it to the county emergency frequencies. The usual chatter, a fender bender on Route 35, someone's cow wandering onto the road near Leon, a medical assist call for an elderly woman in New Haven, normal small town stuff. Around 11:30 p.m. the chatter stopped. Just dead air for maybe 10 minutes, then a burst of static that sounded almost like speech. I adjusted the squelch and tried different channels, but couldn't make out any words. Just that breathing sound again, and what might have been footsteps on gravel. Then the power went out, not just in my house. The whole neighborhood went dark. Through the screen door, I could see the streetlights had died too, and even the signal lights down on Main Street were out. My battery-powered scanner kept working though, and that's when I heard it clearly for the first time, a low whisper that seemed to come from right beside the radio's speaker. "Found you." The whisper came again, clearer now. Not through the radio, that was just static. This was in my ear, close enough to feel the breath that wasn't there. I grabbed a flashlight and went back inside, checking the windows and locks. Everything was secure, but I could swear I heard scratching sounds coming from outside the kitchen window that faces the backyard. When I shined the flashlight through the glass, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving between the trees, too quick and too close to the ground to be human. The power came back on around 2 a.m. I spent the rest of the night at my kitchen table with another cup of coffee, watching the backyard and trying to convince myself I'd imagined everything. The next morning brought a call from the sheriff's dispatcher. Someone had broken into the radio equipment shed up at the TNT area repeater site. Nothing stolen, but the locks had been torn off and there were scratch marks all over the equipment cabinets. I drove up there around noon, taking the winding access road past. The old concrete bunkers that once stored thousands of pounds of TNT. Some of the bunkers still had their steel doors, but most were just hollow concrete shells with weeds growing up through the floors. The whole area felt wrong in daylight. Too quiet, with no bird song or insect buzz. Even the cicadas that had been singing all summer seemed to avoid this place. The repeater shed sits on a small rise overlooking the Kanawha River. About 2 miles from where it joins the Ohio, it's just a prefab metal building with a chain link fence around it, housing the radio equipment and backup generators that keep our emergency communications running. The scratch marks were deep, gouged into the aluminum siding in parallel lines that looked like claw marks. Whatever made them had been strong enough to tear through the metal in some places. Inside the shed, the radio equipment was undamaged, but I found muddy footprints. On the concrete floor, the same elongated prints I'd seen on the roadside that first night, with claw marks at the tips. I was taking photos for my incident report when I noticed something else. Bite marks on the coaxial cables leading up to the antenna array. Not cut with wire strippers, chewed like something with very sharp teeth had been trying to sever the connections. That evening I called Sarah at the library and asked if she could pull together everything she had about the recent sightings. We met at Jerry's diner after hours, spreading the files across a corner booth while Jerry refilled our coffee cups and tried not to look too interested. "The pattern's pretty clear," Sarah said, pointing to a hand-drawn map where she'd marked each incident with a red X. All the sightings happen within a 5-mile radius of the old TNT bunkers, and they're escalating. The timeline started with simple property damage, garbage cans knocked over, small animals found dead with unusual wounds. Then came the window scratching and sleep paralysis episodes. Most recently, there had been 3 home invasion attempts, all in the same general area. "What about the Mothman connection?" I asked. Jerry looked up from where he was wiping down tables. "Haven't been any wing sightings for years," he said. "Not since the Chicago business back in 2019. But some of the old-timers think the two things might be connected." "How so?" "Well," Jerry said, settling into the booth across from us, "the way my grandfather told it, the Mothman was never trying to hurt anybody. More like a warning, something trying to tell people to get away from danger." Sarah nodded. "The Silver Bridge collapse. A lot of witnesses claimed they saw the Mothman on or near the bridge in the days leading up to the disaster." "So what's the warning now?" I asked. Neither of them had an answer for that. I was supposed to do routine maintenance on the tower array the next day, but I decided to wait until I could get someone to come with me. Instead, I spent the afternoon at the Point Pleasant Historical Society, reading through their collection of Mothman memorabilia and trying to understand the timeline. The librarian there, an elderly woman named Dorothy Hayes, remembered the original sightings firsthand. She was a teenager in 1967, living with her parents in a house that backed up to the TNT area. "We used to hear things at night," she told me. "Scratching sounds on the roof, like something with claws was walking around up there. My father would go outside with his shotgun, but he never found anything." "Was that before or after the Mothman sighting started?" "Both," she said. "The scratching sounds started first, maybe a month before Roger Scarberry saw the thing with wings. Then after the bridge collapsed and the Mothman disappeared, the scratching went on for another few weeks before it stopped too." Dorothy pulled out a photo album and showed me a black and white picture of her family's old house. It was a modest 2-story frame building with a steep roof and a wide front porch, situated at the edge of a wooded lot. You could see part of the TNT area in the background. "We moved out in early 1968, she said. "My mother never felt safe there after everything that happened. The new owners tore the house down in the 1980s after they started finding contamination from the old munitions plant. That evening, I drove out to where Dorothy's house used to stand. There's nothing there now but an empty lot overgrown, with sumac and multiflora rose. But I parked at the edge of the road and set up my scanner to monitor the emergency frequencies. The sun set around 6:30, and by 7 p.m. the shadows were long, enough to make the old bunkers look like sleeping animals scattered across the landscape. I was getting ready to leave when the radio chatter stopped. Again, that same dead air I'd experienced at my house. This time I was ready for it. I had a digital voice recorder running, and when the whispers started coming through the radio speaker, I managed to capture about 30 seconds of audio. It wasn't English, at least not any English I recognized. The sounds were more like breathing and clicking noises, with an occasional word that might have been a name. But it was the scratching on my truck's roof that made me hit the gas and get out of there. Deep grooves in the paint, running from front to back like something had jumped on top of the cab and dragged its claws across the metal as I drove away. That night I barely slept. Every small sound made me check the windows, and twice I could have sworn I saw movement in the backyard. Around 3 a.m. I was lying in bed with my eyes closed when I felt it. That sense of being watched that makes the hair on your neck stand up. I opened my eyes and couldn't move. Sleep paralysis is a medical condition I'd read about in the library files, but experiencing it is something else entirely. Your brain is awake, but your body won't respond. You can see and hear everything around you, but you can't move a muscle or make a sound. It's terrifying under the best circumstances. What made it worse was the presence I could sense at the foot of my bed. Not visible exactly, but there, breathing in a rhythm that didn't match my own, shifting its weight from foot to foot on my bedroom floor. The smell hit me next, damp earth and something organic that had been left too long in the rain. The whisper came right next to my ear, so close I could feel the words, even though there was no breath behind them. "Stop looking." The paralysis broke suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch in my brain. I sat up gasping and reached for the light switch, but whatever had been in the room was already gone. The only evidence it had been there at all was muddy prints on my hardwood floor, the same elongated footprints with claw marks that I'd been finding all over the county. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove straight to the sheriff's department. Deputy Collins, the officer who'd been handling the break-in reports, looked tired when I showed him the photos on my phone. "You're the radio guy, right?" he said. "Found the damaged equipment up at the TNT area?" I told him about the sleep paralysis episode and the muddy prints in my bedroom. Collins listened without interruption, taking notes in a small spiral notebook. "Here's the thing," he said when I finished. "We've had 6 similar reports in the past 2 weeks. Always the same pattern. Sleep paralysis, presence in the bedroom, muddy prints on the floor. The prints don't match any known animal species, and they're too big for any of the usual suspects. What do you think it is?" Collins closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, I think something's living in those old bunkers out at the TNT area. Something that doesn't want people poking around. But what about the Mothman sightings? This seems connected somehow." "Maybe," Collins said. "Or maybe we've got 2 different problems. Either way, I'd recommend staying away from that area after dark." But I couldn't let it go. That afternoon I drove to Charleston and bought a military surplus, night vision scope and a motion-activated trail camera. If something was using the TNT bunkers as a base of operations, I was going to get proof. I waited until the weekend to make my move. Saturday evening, I drove up to the TNT area just before sunset, parked my truck about a quarter mile from the nearest bunker, and hiked in with my equipment. The plan was simple: set up the trail camera overlooking the most damaged bunker, find a good observation post, and wait to see what showed up after dark. The bunker I chose was one of the larger ones, maybe 30 feet in diameter with a partially collapsed roof that created shadows even in daylight. The ground around it was torn up like something had been digging, and there were more of those scratch marks on the concrete walls. I mounted the trail camera about 50 yards away, hidden in the fork of an oak tree, and then settled into a position behind a fallen log where I could watch through the night vision scope. The sun went down around 7 p.m., and by 8 p.m., the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath. Nothing happened for the first 2 hours, just the normal sounds of a West Virginia woodland at night, owls calling back and forth, the distant rumble of a freight train, a dog barking somewhere down in the valley. I was starting to think I'd wasted my time when the radio silence started again. I had my scanner set to monitor the emergency frequencies, and at exactly 10:15 p.m. all the chatter stopped. Not just quiet, completely dead, like every radio in the county had been switched off simultaneously. The silence lasted about 5 minutes. Then I started hearing the whispers again. This time, they seemed to be coming from multiple directions, not through the radio speaker but from the woods around me. I adjusted the night vision scope and started scanning the area systematically, looking for any sign of movement. I found it near the damaged bunker, something pale and low to the ground, moving in a way that didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. It seemed to flow rather than walk, covering ground quickly but staying in the shadows, where my scope couldn't get a clear image. Then I heard wings. The sound came from above and behind me, not the rapid flutter of small wings, but the deep, powerful wing beat of something large. I turned the scope skyward and caught a glimpse of a massive shape gliding overhead, blotting out the stars for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. When I looked back toward the bunker, the pale thing was gone, but now I could hear scratching sounds coming from inside the concrete structure, like something with claws was moving around in the darkness. That's when it occurred to me that I might be witnessing some kind of territorial dispute. The Mothman, if that's what I'd seen, was a flying creature, associated with warnings and omens. The thing in the bunker was terrestrial, aggressive, focused on stalking individual victims. Maybe they were natural enemies, or maybe one was trying to warn people away from the other. The thought had barely formed in my mind when something dropped out of the sky and landed on the fallen log right next to me. I couldn't see it clearly through the night. Vision scope. The image was too bright, too close to focus on, but I could smell it. A mixture of wet feathers and electricity, like the air before a thunderstorm. When it moved, I caught glimpses of massive wings folding against a humanoid torso, and eyes that reflected infrared light like mirrors. The whisper came from right beside my ear, but this time the voice was different, deeper, more resonant. Run! I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my equipment and started back toward my truck, trying to move quietly, but knowing that whatever was behind me probably had senses far better than mine. The scratching sounds from the bunker got louder as I moved away, and I could hear something crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. I made it to the truck and got the engine started just as something pale burst out of the tree line about 20 yards away. In my headlights, I got my first clear look at the thing that had been stalking. Mason County residents, hairless white skin stretched over an impossibly thin frame, arms and legs that were too long for its torso, moving on all fours but with joints that bent in, directions that shouldn't have been possible. Its face was the worst part, nearly human but with black eyes that reflected light like an animal's, and a mouth full of teeth that were definitely not meant for eating plants. The thing seemed confused by the headlights, pausing in its charge to shield its eyes. That gave me the opening I needed to throw the truck in gear and get out of there. In my rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the pale creature, now standing upright on its hind legs and easily 8 feet tall, watching me drive away. The motion-activated trail camera captured everything. When I retrieved it the next morning in broad daylight, with Deputy Collins along for backup, the footage showed the pale creature emerging from the bunker around 10:30 p.m. 20 minutes later, something large and winged landed on the bunker's roof and seemed to be calling down into the interior. The audio was mostly whispers and scratching sounds, But at one point you could clearly hear what sounded like an argument. The deep, resonant voice I'd heard saying "run," answered by the higher-pitched clicking sounds that seemed to come from the pale creature. The footage ended abruptly at 11:42 p.m. when something covered the camera lens. When we found it, the camera was 20 feet up in the oak tree where I'd mounted it, but the case was cracked and the memory card was missing. Deputy Collins submitted his report to the state police, but I never heard back about any follow-up investigation. 3 days later, I got a call from my supervisor telling me I was being transferred to a position in Charleston, effective immediately. Better pay, he said, and an opportunity to work with more advanced equipment. I didn't argue. My lease was month to month, and I'd never put down deep roots in Point Pleasant anyway. By the end of the week, I was packed and ready to go. But before I left, I stopped by Jerry's diner one last time. He was alone, cleaning the grill and getting ready to close up for the night. "Heard you're moving on," he said without looking up. "Time for a change," I told him. "The county's brought in some experts to handle the radio interference issues." Jerry just nodded and kept scrubbing. After a while he said, "You know, my grandfather used to say the Mothman wasn't the problem. It was trying to warn people about the real problem. What do you think the real problem is?" Jerry finally looked up, and his expression was troubled. "Something that's been sleeping in those bunkers for a long time. Something that got woken up when they started doing environmental cleanup work out there 5 years ago. You think it's still there?" "I think," Jerry said, "that some warnings are worth listening to." I drove out of Point Pleasant that evening just as the sun was setting, taking Route 35 across the new Silver Memorial Bridge that replaced the one that collapsed in 1967. In my rearview mirror, I could see the lights of the town reflected in the Ohio River, and beyond that, the dark outline of the hills where the old TNT bunkers waited in the shadows. My radio picked up a news bulletin as I reached the far side of the bridge. Mason County authorities are investigating reports of unusual animal activity in the McClintock Wildlife Management Area. Residents are advised to avoid the area after dark until further notice. The bulletin was followed by static, then a whisper so faint I might have imagined it. "Thank you. I work for the State Emergency Management Agency now, monitoring radio communications across 3 counties. It's good work, and Charleston is a nice city with plenty of distractions. I've got an apartment on the west side with no view of the river, and I sleep better at night. But sometimes, when I'm driving the back roads checking tower sites, I'll catch a fragment of that familiar breathing sound on the AM bands. And once, just once, I spotted something, large and winged, gliding across the highway, about 20 miles south of Charleston, moving too fast and too purposeful to be any natural bird. I think about Dorothy Hayes and her family, and how they moved away from the TNT area in 1968 after the scratching. Sounds finally stopped. I think about Carol Reeves, who left Mason County after something breathed on her neck while she slept. And I think about all the other people who've encountered things they couldn't explain and decided that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Mothman sightings stopped after the Silver Bridge collapse, but they started up again when the environmental cleanup began disturbing. Things that should have been left alone. Maybe that's the real warning, that some places are dangerous, not because of what flew out of them, but because of what was sleeping there all along. Sometimes protection looks like a monster with wings and glowing red eyes, standing between you and something far worse. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is listen when it tells you to run. I still have the audio recording I made that night in the TNT area. 30 seconds of whispers and breathing sounds that might be nothing more than radio interference, or might be something trying to communicate across a gap wider than species or understanding, On quiet nights, when the static is low and the signals are clear, I sometimes play it back and wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in Point Pleasant long enough to decode what it was trying to tell me. But then I remember the muddy footprints on my bedroom floor and the smell of damp earth and decay, and I'm grateful that some questions don't need answers. The last thing I heard from Mason County was a brief mention on the state police scanner frequency about a month after I moved to Charleston. Someone had found fresh scratch marks on one of the remaining TNT bunkers, and there were reports of unusual radio interference in the area. The transmission ended with a burst of static, followed by what might have been the sound of wings in the distance.